Well, it's good to be back. I was at a Quaker pastor's retreat this week, which sounds which was as exciting as it sounds to be with 40 Quaker pastors and watch them let their hair down and act like Pentecostals for a couple days. We had a very good time. And then last weekend, Joanne and I were gone. We went down to the farmhouse and to work outside, cleaning away the dross of winter, picking up fallen sticks, raking the flower beds, mowing the yard, weed whipping around the barns, and sweeping the porches, and our favorite thing to do in spring, opening the windows to let the breeze blow through and refresh the house. Is there no better feeling ever in the world? I think of that wind coming off of the Rocky Mountains and across the Great Plains, across Kansas and Iowa and Illinois, into Indiana, scouring everything clean, including the dust balls in our farmhouse that swirl around before getting sucked up by our vacuum cleaner and carried outside to the trash can, out with the old and in with the new. Spring is a good time to make plans. This past March, over spring break, we went to Kentucky. Joanne and I did, to visit Joanne's brother Jack, who has Parkinson's disease. And while we were there visiting, Jack put me in charge of his ashes distribution. He's a very organized man and also very matter-of-fact about it. The Apple family faces the challenges of life directly, without drama. There's a grove of trees in the upper meadow across the road from our farmhouse, and Jack told me that he wanted me to bury his ashes there in the old family cemetery. And I thought to myself, what old family cemetery? I've been up in those woods for 40 years and I've never seen them. So he told me where it was. And Joanne and I spent part of last weekend looking for it up there in the woods, and eventually found some square hand-hewn stones that could possibly have been tombstones, headstones, and we found an old quarry from which the foundation stones for the apple houses and barns had been dug and cut some 150 years ago. It was very interesting. It's a humbling thought to stand amidst a family graveyard deep in the woods and remember how simply and directly our ancestors faced death. Things have certainly changed. Linen shrouds and pine boxes have given way to custom caskets built far away by people we don't know. Family graveyards in woodlots and pastures have been replaced by well-groomed cemeteries. Shovels wielded by family and friends have gone by the way, replaced by the excavator, expertly wielded by the men from the burial vault company who stand respectfully off to the side until everyone is gone before filling in the grave of someone they never knew. We pay people to do things we used to do for ourselves, except for the Apple family. I fully expect, this is my prediction, that Joanne's brother will drive himself to the family farm the week before his death, where he will dig the hole for his ashes and then pry out a boulder from the quarry, hew it into a rectangle, then chisel his name on it, which in a way is a great way to face suffering and death. When faced directly, they lose their sting. We've been talking lately and dwelling on this whole topic of the basic tenets of the Christian faith in light of the rise of Christian nationalism, which we've all looked at and said to ourselves, how is that Christianity? Well, it isn't. It isn't. But how did we get there? Well, we got that way through bad theology. Christian nationalism is both a distortion of Christianity and a renunciation of America's noblest virtues. One focus of Christianity, indeed a focus of almost every religion, has been to answer the question of suffering. Why do we suffer? Now, traditionally, Christians have said we suffer because of the sin of Adam and Eve, because of humankind's inherently sinful nature. That before sin, we were strangers to suffering and evil, but then sin opened the door to calamity and pain and disease and death and all these horrible things. And if you know me, and if you've been paying any attention to anything I've ever said in the past 22 years here, you know that I thoroughly reject that absurdity. I thoroughly reject it. It makes no sense to me. Which doesn't mean I reject suffering. Suffering is very real. And our response to it shapes and fashions how we live together. Consequently, Christian nationalism can't be fully explained by racism, which we're quick to do. Well, that's just racism at work. Well, yeah, that's one of the causes. And it can't totally be explained by ignorance or fascism. It also must be explained by grief. Wherever Christian nationalism has raised its head, grief and fear were dominant factors, either grieving a perceived loss of privilege and power, or grieving a perceived loss of identity and status. Behind every movement of racism and fascism can be found someone grieving the loss of something they thought essential to their well-being. I believe this is true not only for individuals, but for cultures and countries. Underneath the rant of anger is invariably found the wail of loss and suffering. The only way around this is to always remind ourselves of two great truths. Suffering is inevitable, and no one is exempt. No one. To live is to suffer. To live is to experience loss. There is simply no avoiding it. There have been persons in my life whose I have looked at from a distance and envied, thinking that from what I could see, their lives were perfect. Beautiful home, bright children, wealth, good health, popularity, hair. They had it all. But every time I have felt that way about someone, I have eventually learned that even their lives had seasons of suffering and loss. Even their lives. Everyone, every person I have ever met, suffering is inevitable. No one is exempt. And if we believe we are exempt, if we believe we deserve to sit squarely at the top of life's heap, untouched by hardship or tragedy, then suffering, when it finally and inevitably visits us, will twist and deform us, and maybe even break us. There is no person so angry and broken as the person who thought themselves exempt from hardship or suffering, who thought themselves superior, invincible, and now knows otherwise and cannot bear it. But suffering is inevitable. No one is exempt. I remember when sociologists first announced that at the current rate of birth and immigration, the United States would no longer be a majority white nation by the year 2045. And I remember thinking to myself, isn't that fascinating? Isn't that fascinating? That is wonderful. That will spice things up. All kinds of people from everywhere. How fun will that be? More personally, I thought of pale, pasty Gulleys marrying exotic people from other cultures and having the most gorgeous grandchildren. Couldn't we all use a little more color? Yes, I think we can. But what I welcomed, what I anticipated and looked forward to with deep interest was seen by others as a threat to their privilege, and they began to march, chanting, "You will not replace us. Jews will not replace us," as if the universe should act to suit them, as if the universe should change its direction to keep them on top, as if cultural trends should ground to a halt to accommodate them. There is no person so angry and broken as the person who thought themselves superior and now knows otherwise and cannot bear it. Theology 101. Suffering is inevitable. No one is exempt. No one is exempt. It isn't because our ancestors disobeyed God. It is because we are human and we are alive. And to be alive in this world is to know not only great joy and happiness, but also great pain and loss. Those who are spiritually healthy learn from their suffering and do not resent it. Nor do they spend their life trying to avoid pain at any cost. They learn that they are not always protected from difficulty. And when they learn that and accept that, when we learn that we're not always protected from difficulty, and when we accept that, we become more wholly human, more fully alive, more loving, more mature, and ironically, even more joyful. It isn't suffering that makes us sad. It isn't suffering that makes us sad. It is our continued anger about our suffering that depresses us and weighs us down. Suffering needn't be the death of our joy. Indeed, when accepted and thoughtfully engaged, suffering can become the doorway through which wholeness and joy are found. Think of a perfect world where spouses care for one another, where everyone knows the joy of family love, where creation is honored and tended well and beautifully, where world leaders sit down and talk rather than build armies and fight. Think for a moment of everyone having enough to eat, someone to love, someone to care for and be cared for. Think of that world. This week, friends, let us create that world. Let us create the family we have always dreamed of having. Let us create the neighborhood in which we've always wanted to live. Let us create the towns and cities that make us happy and bring joy to others. Let us create a state that honors all people. And let us create a nation that reveres and respects the wide spectrum of God's creation. And finally, friends, working together, let us create a world in which all people everywhere are known and loved and cherished. This is our work this week. This is our holy calling to create such a beautiful and wonderful world. Let's roll up our sleeves. Amen. Turn and greet friends.